All right. Hello. Hello and welcome to CocoaHeads for 2021. It's our first meetup. We're here in February and have decided to caption this one. It's got to be better than last year, which, as someone has pointed out in Slack, might be tempting fate. But anyway, let's begin. So on that note, you can join the Slack group if you want to participate in discussions for tonight's meetup. We've got YouTube comments below, which we generally don't use, but definitely join the Slack group. It's on screen at the moment, the link to join that, and I'll post another link. Sorry, I'll have another link on a later slide if you miss it, and you can jump in there. You can communicate with the speakers in real time. Both of the talks tonight were pre-recorded, so they're going to be in the Slack for any questions you might have, and that's probably the best way to interact with everyone during the meetup tonight. So to begin with, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders, both past and present. As always, a little bit of housekeeping. We're your CocoaHeads team. So I'm Zach. Hey, everyone. I've got Nikki on the call as well.
Hey, everyone. How's it going?
And there's also Carl who helps us out. Any questions, concerns, queries, or anything at all, just feel free to send any of us a message on Slack and we'll get to you as soon as we can. As always, a big thank you to our sponsors. We've got Bilu and Atlassian for helping cover our costs for running the meetup. So thanks, Bilu and Atlassian. And a reminder that CocoaHeads has a code of conduct. We want everyone to feel welcome and comfortable at all of our meetups. That includes our online ones. If you think anyone might be in violation of the code of conduct or have any questions, feel free to contact myself, Carl, or Nikki. You can read the policy in full on the website, but it boils down to 3 important points. They are be respectful, be inclusive, and be aware. So as mentioned at the top of the call, CocoaHeads has a Slack community. Feel free to join. It's great on the night for nights like this for real-time communication, but it's also great throughout the month as people post questions or just have general chatter in some of the channels in there. It can be a bit of fun. So a big shout out to everyone attending CocoaHeads for the first time, especially those who might not be in Sydney who are now able to attend, given the remoteness of this meetup. So yeah, welcome everyone. If we were in person, everyone would be standing up and you'd be clapped, but I guess that can't happen right now. So some other events to keep an eye on. It's a little bit too early in the year for many conferences and things like that to have been announced, but I did want to give a shout out to our friends over at Melbourne CocoaHeads. They run a meetup very similar to this on the second Thursday of the month. We do ours on the third Thursday of the month. If you like this meetup, you'll definitely like theirs. There's always some great talks. It's very entertaining. So definitely recommend checking them out if you can. So if anyone is looking for work or is hiring or knows of someone hiring, feel free to post about that in the jobs channel on the Slack group. There's usually a few people in there looking for work or looking for people to hire. So hopefully you can find a match there. A little bit about what's happening tonight. We have a month in review. It's really more like a 3-month in review since we haven't done a meetup since the end of November. I've gone back to sort of the beginning of December with some of the key points to go over since then. We've got our first talk by David Reedy. It's going to be on strings with a very long title, which I believe he explains at the start of his presentation. And we've also got a 10-minute lightning talk from Tom from Bare Feetwear, building an app like Lego with SwiftUI. Following both of those talks, we'll have a Zoom catch-up, and I'll post the link to the Zoom chat in the Slack group at the end of the meetup. And so feel free to jump on there and have a chat with fellow developers. Our next meetup will be in March. It'll be on the third Thursday again. As always, we're looking for talks. Feel free to submit a talk through that URL on the website, or just message myself, Carl, or Nikki directly, and we can get back to you. And as always, we're looking for month in review or lightning talks as well. So anything goes. Feel free to ask me any questions you might have about that, and just get in touch if you're interested in giving a talk. So let's get into the month in review. So sort of late last year, the Apple Developer Small Business Program came into effect. And what this essentially means is that if your apps bring in a total of less than $1 million per year, you're eligible for a 15% cut on the App Store instead of the old 30%. Businesses that earn over $1 million will still have to pay the 30%, but this is a nice change for a majority of devs. We also had App Store privacy labels come into effect, and these have been interesting. They are meant to be an indication of what data apps are collecting about you, so you can make an informed choice about using apps and comparing them. For example, if you've got two to-do apps and one of them collects everything about you and the other is very privacy conscious, you might go for the more privacy conscious one, at least hopefully anyway. So it's always interesting now before downloading an app to kind of check its privacy label and see what it's up to under the scenes. We also had Apple Fitness Plus launch on the 15th of December. So that's Apple's new subscription fitness service. It's pretty nice, and some of the integration between the Apple Watch and like the TV, for example, is pretty neat. But I myself have had quite a bit of problems with it, getting the watch to stay connected and things like that. The workouts cutting out during the session. So I've actually stopped using it. But I'd be interested to hear in the Slack if anyone else has used it and what your experience has been like. Because unfortunately, it's been frustrating for me, but I know that's not everyone's experience. You can also now host a Mac instance on Amazon EC2, which is kind of cool. So Mac's in the cloud, and I think you pay by the hour or per the day or something like that. And so you get all the benefits of Amazon's scaling and things like that if you want to run like a build machine or whatever on Amazon. Some more App Store news. Developers can let you share copies of your in-app purchase with your family members if you use family sharing. So if one of you has bought a subscription or bought an App Store unlock for something, that can be shared with members of your family. It's quite cool. In other news, so iOS 14.5 and watchOS 7.4 are now in beta, public beta and developer beta. And one of the coolest new features that I thought is you can now unlock your iPhone with your Apple Watch if you're wearing a mask. So the way that this works is it detects that a mask is covering your face, Face ID can't unlock it, but it goes, oh, hey, the Apple Watch is nearby. That's probably good enough grounds to let the phone unlock anyway. And then you get this nice little display on your Apple Watch. It vibrates and lets you know that the phone's been unlocked with a one-click sort of tap to lock the phone again, just in case it wasn't you and somebody got a hold of your phone. Some other iOS 14.5 features that I think are noteworthy. You can now use 5G if you have dual SIM cards in your iPhone. That's pretty cool. We got a bunch of new emojis. Some of them are on the right there, but who doesn't love some new emoji? You can change a default music streaming service. You can share lyrics in Apple Music. And there's also the app tracking transparency changes, which are going to come into effect. So that is allowing a user can optionally allow a developer to have access to their device's unique identifier for those kind of app tracking purposes. We also got a devs forum update, pretty boring, but the part that I found quite amusing is that there is now a new feature that will send you emails when somebody responds to your post. I cannot tell you the number of times I've gotten to check a dev forums post only to visit it a couple months later and realize that somebody else has sent a reply and I totally missed it at the time. Some late news, which I threw in this morning. Facebook stopped showing and sharing of news from Australian media outlets as of this morning. I have nothing to say here. This is a very controversial topic, but I'm just putting it in as news. So if you tried to visit ABC News on Facebook this morning, it was a blank feed, as well as many other news sources. All right, so let's get into our talks for this evening. The first one is by David, Useful Stuff String. And it's pre-recorded, so if you've got any questions as we go, feel free to jump in the Slack and ask David. Otherwise, I'm going to be quiet and let the video play.
G'day everyone, I'm David Reedy, and welcome to my presentation. Useful Stuff String. If you don't get the rest of the reference, it's because it's from a very, very old Monty Python album. The Contractual Obligation album, which I think is the very early 80s, maybe even the late 70s. This presentation was developed and recorded on the lands of the Darug and Gundungurra people. For tens of thousands of years, they have been the custodians of this place. I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. So we're going to look at strings in the context of a project that I am currently working on. If you're old enough, like as old as me, you might remember this. It's the original version, or the original sort of popular version of Dungeons and Dragons. It came out late 70s, early 80s. If you're a bit younger and you know about Dungeons and Dragons, you might recognize this version, which is the current 5th edition of the game. D&D has over the past few years become a lot more popular due to a number of reasons. It appears in Stranger Things. It's the basis for the first season and takes off from there. And if you're a bit more nerdy, then from a series of podcasts called Critical Role, video podcast called Critical Role. If you look at that, yes, that's nearly 34 million views for these videos. And this is campaign 2. There's a campaign 1 as well. It's 124 videos in them. And they're not 15 minutes each. They're each around 4+ hours. So there's over 500 hours of video in this one collection. And as you can see, at 34 million views, it's fairly popular. You can blame Matt Mercer as the bloke in the photograph for that. But it's becoming a lot more popular. I've been playing Dungeons & Dragons for a long time. And of course, with the pandemic at the moment, so much else has moved online that, of course, so has playing Dungeons & Dragons. A number of pluses and a number of minuses. It's certainly much easier to get a group together now if everybody's playing online. Even before the pandemic, there were 3 main ways of playing Dungeons & Dragons online. One was Fantasy Grounds Unity. That's the one I use with the group that I play with. Roll20 is a very similar product. It runs cheaper to begin with, more expensive in the long run. And the Wizards of the Coast, the people that own Dungeons & Dragons, even have their own. It's called D&D Beyond, which has some limitations, but is still very popular. All 3 of those pieces of software are very popular. Add to that the fact that everyone's got Zoom, and D&D Online has become, one of those things that a lot more people do in the last year than they had in the years before. So, what's my project about? Well, I'm an optimist, and I think eventually we'll get back to in-person playing. One of the nice things about the online versions of D&D is that they take away a lot of the looking up the rule books, the working with the maths, and basically having a whole lot of fiddly things to do that get in the way of this story part of D&D. And so basically when we're back to playing in person, I would like to be able to, again, get rid of a lot of the nitty-gritty mechanical stuff that takes time, the stuff that gets in the way of the story. And so that's what the project is that I'm working on. It might also work online, but I'm actually designing it so people who are sitting around a D&D table can play the game. Because even the group I play in are not all iOS people, it needs to work on both iOS and Android, of course. And I don't like these common frameworks, so we're going to do multi-native. It would also be nice if in the long run it can work for games other than Dungeons & Dragons. Dungeons & Dragons was the first, and I would say possibly the best of the games, but certainly there are a lot of other role-playing games around now that are proving to be very popular. And in many other settings, such as steampunk and science fiction and things like that. But these are text-based adventures, and we're going to end up with a lot of text. It's not called that for nothing. The whole basis of this is the telling of stories, maybe the writing down of stories, certainly the reading out of descriptions and things that come with the adventures. Other things that are played with maps, illustrations, models aren't necessary to play Dungeons and Dragons. All you need really is a good imagination. The storytelling is the key, and the nitty-gritty of rolling dice and things tends to get a bit in the way of the flow of stories. So that's what I'm trying to come up with a solution for. And so there is a lot of text to deal with, and the application is going to be about dealing with a lot of text, at least in the early stages. So if we're talking text, then for programming, of course, we're talking strings, an ordered collection of characters if you go all the way back to C. In Objective-C, of course, we had NS-string, and in Swift, we have string, which is built on NS-string, I think, but maybe it could be a little easier to work with. Many of the things we took for granted in Objective-C we don't have in Swift. Once you're used to them, Swift's really good, but it does take a little bit of getting used to if all you've done as play with character arrays in C or Objective-C. A lot of other data outside of games and things are made up of strings. Most of the stuff stored in at least in simple SQL databases is string data. So being able to manipulate strings and do fun things with them is not a bad skill to have. And of course, doing it well, doing it efficiently is important. We're on mobile devices, and though we've got a fair bit of processing power, we're still limited compared with desktops. And the app I'm working on, one would hope, is going to be played on mobile devices, mainly not PCs. How are we going to implement it? Well, we're going to use string extensions. String extensions are probably the easiest way to go. There are already many things you can do with strings. It makes sense just to extend that so we can do the things that we want to do. Also, if we put things in that we want to do and make them easy to use, it's a lot more likely they will get used. Specifically things to do with security, we look at cleaning strings, and making sure that your strings are clean is sort of really important. So if you want people to do it, make it easy to do. So we're going to look at 3 different extensions for doing different things with strings. First of all, we're going to look at cleaning strings, how to make a string safe for use inside your program. We're going to look at how to make a string secure, not in terms of banking, but in terms of making information in the string either obscure so no one can see it, or at least tamper-proof, which is what I'm going after. And then finally, we're going to look at ways of using strings to make them really flexible so that they can be used to build up more colorful descriptions in the case of the one we're going to be looking at. So what is a safe string? Well, the easiest way to get into somewhere is via the front door. The easiest way to get into our software is, again, through the front door, through the openings we make to allow our users to get into our programs. In other words, we ask them to type in text and they give us text. Now, I am sure that, of course, all of our users are honourable and would never do anything untoward, but they might make a typo, and there are some people on the internet, apparently, whose intentions are less than honourable. So you never know. It's a good idea to basically don't trust anyone and make sure that any information coming into our program is, in fact, secure. One of the standard things that is warned about is the SQL injection attack. That is basically where someone sends you text that it contains a SQL instruction. So the key, don't trust what someone tells you. And of course, that has been made famous by Bobby Tables. Bobby Tables appears in XKCD's cartoon Exploits of a Mum, and you can see it here. Swift gives us many ways to manipulate the contents of a string, and we can use those tools that it gives us to make sure that our strings are safe. One of the problems is the apostrophe. The apostrophe is a character in SQL that is used to delimit strings. So if we were trying to be careful with strings, one of the things we might want to do is make sure that our users don't give us an apostrophe, because they could be using it to make an unsafe SQL command. Unfortunately, though, the apostrophe is also needed in English. It's needed in text strings, and even if you're not dealing with strings, it's needed in names. So we have to allow our users to give us apostrophes. Somehow we've got to make sure that they're both, we need to make sure that they give them to us safely. And there's a trick. Unicode gives us a thing called the right single quotation mark, or the little curly quote. In an English string, it looks fine, but it makes absolutely no sense to a SQL parser. So consequently, if we replace any apostrophes that our users give us with single quotation marks, with right single quotation marks, then that should make our string safe. The Unicode for it is U2019, as we'll see in the code when we look at it in a moment. And I've tested it with MySQL, which is what I use on my databases, and anything with this in it, it just doesn't understand it as an apostrophe. It's fine treating it as a character in a name string, though. So let's define our extension on string. The first thing we're going to do is to define the characters that we'll allow to go through without being changed. So to do that, we need to define a character set. We're going to begin simply by allowing all the normal alphanumeric characters. And to that, we're going to add all the normal whitespace characters. Because what we're going to be working with is mainly English sentences, we want to add all the punctuation characters as well. Well, actually, we don't want to add all the punctuation characters because two of them may cause problems. That's the semicolon and the backslash. So we're going to remove them from our allowed characters. Then finally, we return our character set. Now that we've got our allowed characters defined, we can then go to add percent encoding, which will basically turn anything that we haven't got in our allowed characters list into a percent string, making it inactive. And then finally, the last character we might have a problem with is the single quote because it has a special meaning in SQL, but we still need to include it in our English strings. We can use a trick for that. We can replace a single quote with a single curly quote, which in our strings will look fine, but of course won't work at all with SQL. So we've simply replaced that single quote with the Unicode equivalent, which is 2019. I also want to have a function that will mutate a string in place, so we'll add that in. And all we'll do there is call the function on itself. And there's our string cleaning done. Now, of course, we should test it. And so here are our tests. We test firstly that nothing happens to a string that doesn't need cleaning. So that's our first test. Because we're using percent encoding, I thought it was probably sensible to check that percents themselves go through okay. So that's what the second one, test cleaning with percent, does. And then finally, we want to make sure that a potentially malicious string, the famous Bobby Tables attack, we want to make sure that is cleaned properly. So we check that the semicolon has been removed, which it has. We check that the single quote has been removed, which it has. And we check that it was turned into a curly quote, which it was. So we can be pretty sure that our code is doing what we want it to do. The next thing we're going to look at is how to encrypt data inside Swift. As I said, this isn't, if you're a banking application, don't listen to me. All I need to be able to do is to keep data so it can't be tampered with. Basically, inside the game, details about characters, what they can do, what level they are, how much gold they have, things like that are stored as strings. I just want to be able to keep the strings so they can't be altered. We could just store them in this keychain, but these things need to get passed around. The application uses local networking, so these strings need to get passed around. So it's basically easier to pass them around encrypted and then decrypt them at either end. So we want to keep the data tamper-proof. What I want to be able to do, I want the data to go in as a string, come out as a string, and I want the key to be a string because it's easier to just handle strings, obviously. And that's both for encryption and for decryption. Again, the cipher text goes in as a string. We get the plain text out as a string. And once again, of course, the key is just a string. So that way, strings are easy to store. We can store them in databases. We can store them in the keychain. And in this case, although in mine, the key is not supplied by the user, I do want to keep this flexible enough so that if I do need to use a key supplied by a user, this works with that as well without putting onerous requirements on the user. Swift gives us Common Crypto and CryptoKit for doing this. So that's what we're going to be using. And basically, they're pretty good. They've got pretty much everything you need for cryptography, I think up to and including banks. But as I said, don't trust me on that one. They're optimized for iOS. One of the nice things is that because Apple control the silicon, their processors, both the M1 processor and the processor that is used in iOS devices, they're all optimized for the routine. So these are very, very quick. Any Mac that's got a T2 chip, even if it doesn't have an M1 chip, has got hardware to do these encryption operations. So you're not paying a big overhead to make sure your data stays secure. And look, these are certainly good enough for a game. I mean, basically, with Dungeons and Dragons, there's not really any point in cheating, but these are certainly good enough to keep it fine. Let's have a look at the code for doing encryption. Notice that in addition to SwiftUI, we've now had to import the Common Crypto and CryptoKit libraries. Let's start with the encryption function itself. We're going to have our user enter a key, which basically can be anything. But for encryption to work, we need to have a key that is 256 bits long. So to get that, we're simply going to use the hash function to take whatever it was the user entered and turn that into something that will be of the right length and is reasonably secure. Once we've got the hash, we'll make the key itself. Then we'll turn our string into data, and we'll make another data object to hold our encryption. The next bit goes in a do catch block because it might fail. And we use the seal function to create a cryptographically secure set of data. Let's catch any errors. And then we'll return our data with a base 64 encoding so that it comes back as a string rather than as data blob. And that's pretty much all there is to it. If we want to make the version of the function that will mutate a string in place, it's as simple as declaring the function and then calling the encrypted function and assigning the result to self. Decryption is very similar. Again, we have a key provided by the user, and we hope it's the same one if they want to get their data back. Again, we create the hash and turn the hash into a key. We then take our base 64 encoded string and turn that back into data. And then we're going to try to decrypt it. We make a sealed box using the data that we were given. We attempt to open it using the key. And then we turn the data that we get back, if it's been correctly decrypted, into the string and return that. We still need to catch the errors. And if there was an error, we'll just return the string undecrypted. So we'll return whatever it was passed in. And again, we can add the mutating version. And there's our encryption and decryption done. Of course, we're going to need to test it. Let's have a look at the tests we have to test encryption and decryption. They have to work together, so there's just the one set of tests. We start at the top. We just check that if we do encrypt a string, that we can decrypt it and we get back what we started with. So that's our first test. We then had better check that it's working and actually doing something. So we'll try and decrypt that now with the wrong password and make sure that we do not get back the original text, and we don't. We also want to check that if we do decrypt with the wrong password, all we get back is the original string. So no possible hints or anything. We just get back what you put in if you got it wrong. So we have a test for that. We then check that the same thing encrypts differently using different passwords. So we check that. We also check that if we encrypt something with a different password, we do get different encryption back. We then check to see that if we encrypt the same thing twice with the same password, we in fact get different things back. And here we do. We make sure that the blank message can be correctly encrypted, and it does. We check that we can encrypt with a blank password, not a terribly sensible thing to do, but it shouldn't crash our code. And if we decrypt with the blank password, we do still get back the encrypted string. And just to check, we make sure that we can encrypt the blank string with blank password, and that works as well. We follow that up with the same sort of test using the mutating encryption. We know that it's using the same code, so we don't need to do as much testing for calling it that way. So there are just a few there just to make sure that it is working and that we haven't done anything silly. Finally, let's look at how to make some flexible descriptions. So to set the scene, RPGs are made of words. That's, as I said before, that's the basis. The storytelling is the key to the game. In many cases, there are descriptions of things, and in some cases, the parameters that are inside a description will change. And so we need some way of storing these flexibly enough that they're easy to use, and we'll do all sorts of nice things. One of the biggest things about moving Dungeons and Dragons adventures into a computer program is the amount of stuff that needs to be entered. And I only want to write descriptions once. But I want them to work in English and Italian and Russian and Japanese and Arabic and German and any other language. And it would be really nice if they could all work in these languages at the same time for groups that have people that speak different languages. Of course, it has to work on both iOS and Android because, not everybody has iOS devices. So a solution I have come up with is to use regular expressions to take a sort of generic description and turn that into a more personalized description for the player. If I'm going to type all of this in, or if I'm going to give somebody else the job of typing all this in, the source text still has to be simple and pretty much read like English still. We get a lot of flexibility because regex allows us to pick a pattern within text with great flexibility. Once again, XKCD has this covered, and here we have his famous "I know regular expressions" comic. And I mean, using regex is fairly powerful if you can work out the syntax, which is not at all obvious. So here's one way of doing it. I want to define something that will sit in our description text and looks like this: a size and a unit type. Now, to begin with, I'm handling 3 different types of units. I'm handling short distances, so a few meters, a few tens of feet, that sort of thing. Long distances, kilometers and miles, and weight, pounds and kilograms. I do want this to work in imperial and metric. Dungeons and Dragons, being written in the United States in the mid-1970s, uses imperial measurements. For some reason, so do a lot of other RPGs, even if they're not written in the United States. But these measurements are becoming increasingly irrelevant, especially outside the US. In fact, in the group I play with, I am the only one in the group old enough to have used the imperial measuring system at school. Everybody else grew up on the metric system. But let's put both. There are a lot of D&D players in the United States. They're going to want to use imperial. A lot of other people who I think, if they had the choice, would like to use metric. So we'll do both. So we're going to get descriptions such as you throw the ball 30 feet. And if we just convert that, then you would get something. If we go metric, you would get something like you throw the ball 9.14 meters, which doesn't make a lot of sense. We'd really like it to say you throw the ball 9 meters. Let's have a look at the method I used to come up with the syntax for a regular expression. So let's have a look at a way we can build up our regular expressions. This is the regexa.com website, which is a really great place to experiment with regular expressions. I always start by putting in some text that I can match against. I find it's easier to watch what's happening rather than try and do it in my head first. So here are 6 strings, the first 3 of which I hope will match, and the last 3 of which I hope will not match. Let's get started. So we know that our matching expression needs to start with 2 less thans. You see that's starting to match up. And we want it to finish with 2 greater thans. Now we haven't got anything matching. If we look at those ones up the top there, they always start with a number or a digit. Now, a digit in a regular expression is represented by \D. And if we put that there, we're still not getting a match. We also notice that they all finish with the word short distance. So we'll put that in. Now, everything we've put in so far has to match exactly. We don't have any special codes in there. So if we had just less than, short distance, greater than, we'd get a match, but that's not what we have. To work properly, these things have to start with a number, and a number is made up of digits. So at the beginning here, let's put in a digit. And there we can see the first one matches. Not all of them are going to have one digit, as we can see in the second and third ones. So we need to have at least one, but possibly more digits. And the way we represent that is with a plus. So now we can see that the two that only have integers are matching, but not the 14.2 version. So we need to handle a decimal. Well, a decimal is always going to start with a dot. We don't need to worry about the fact that in some places a decimal is a comma, because these strings are ones that we are going to control. So we'll have a dot followed by one or possibly more digits. So again, /d plus gives us one or possibly more digits. But our decimals are optional. As we can see, the 8 and the 20 no longer match. So to make this whole bit optional, we put it in parentheses and follow it with a question mark. And now we can see that the three that we want to match are matching. The three that we don't want to match aren't matching, which is a good thing. And so although this might not be where we end up, it's a pretty good place to start with our regular expressions. And now let's look at the code that uses it. So let's have a look at the code for replaced short distance. Our two parameters, use metric and use imperial, let us force the use of one of the measurement systems. If they're both false, it will use whatever the system default is. Once we know which one we're using, we need to set the scale factor. In the case of short distance, for metric, the scale is 1.5. And the singular name of the unit is meter. The plural name is meters. And of course, we had to declare those variables. We need to set the same thing up if we're using the imperial measurements. In this case, one unit will be 5 feet. We're now going to start working with the regular expressions, many of which can throw errors. So we're going to put the next lot of code inside a do block. The first thing we're going to do is to define the regular expression that we need to find the entire bracketed parts of our description. And of course, this is using the regular expression pattern that we got earlier working with the website. We need a second regular expression so that we can just pull out the digits at the front of that as well. We're going to be searching over the full range of the string that we've got coming in, so we need to define the range. Then we'll run the first of the regular expressions and find all the matches that come back. Then we'll work our way through those finds to do the replacements. So for each of those, we get the range that has actually been selected by the regular expression. And if for some reason that fails, we'll just return the unmodified string. We'll get the substring that is in that range. We'll then get the number that's at the front using that second regular expression. Get the exact range. And the substring. Now that we've got the substring, we'll turn it into a double and work out the new value, which is simply the number that we've got from the string multiplied by the scaling factor. Then we'll create the new string, which is that new value number that we just created, followed by either the plural or the singular of the units. In order to get it to format nicely, we need to have a number formatter. We'll add that in up the top. And we'll set the number of decimal points just to 1. We don't want ridiculously accurate measurements being put up because they don't make a lot of sense in the game. Finally, we can replace the substring with our nice new string and return that as the result. Now, of course, we better do something to catch all those potential errors in the do block. I usually surround that with if debug just so it gets taken out when we do the final compilations. And if all else fails, just return the string unchanged. And that's our replace short distance. We do a similar one for replace long distance and one for replace weight. We'll just quickly look at the replaced measurements code. Here you can see that we use a regular expression, this bit just here, to select just the second part of each of those tags that we've included. And then we just do a switch statement on that, whatever it was we found, and then use either the short distance, the long distance, or the weight processing. It means that we can just do one call on a string that may contain multiple ones of these. We also keep track of which ones have been processed because we only need to use each of the expansions once on a given string, but it is possible there might be more than one type of each of the tags in that string. So we just check it and only do it once if we need to. These are the tests that we're using to make sure that our short distance replacement is working properly. The first one tests if we've got an integer value going in. So our test string is you can move 6 short distance in a straight line. It should use the system default. On my simulator, I have that set for metric. So I should get a metric one back. Setting metric to true should also, of course, give me the metric one back. And then setting imperial to true should give it back to me in imperial measurements, which it does. The second part then checks to see that it looks okay when there are fractional results. So again, we check all 3 of them, but in this case for the metric measurement, we're going to get 7.5 meters. We can just make sure that that looks right and we're not getting, again, something that looks out of place. The second set of tests just work with a decimal number going in to the replacement string, and we can see that, again, we get the correct things. We get metric for the system default, a correct metric one for metric, and a correct imperial one for imperial. Again, both all showing the right number of decimal places. So that's not a bad way of checking to make sure that we haven't done anything silly. So if you're interested in my current project, I am looking for some test flyers at the moment. It would be very handy if you play or at least have played D&D, so you at least understand what's going on. Later on, I'll extend it, but at the moment, you need to know. You need to know how to play the game. You need to be prepared to have the latest iOS version. At the moment, it runs iOS 14.4. I will probably settle on 14.5. That should be fine. This is not going to be ready before iOS 15 is out. And it would be nice if you're happy to offer some feedback. I really do value other people's opinions of at least how playable the game is. If you're interested, drop me an email, david@uteach, and I'd be happy to welcome you on board. Finally, if you want to contact me about anything else, or any of the stuff tonight, you'd like sample code or something, that's the email. Just gave that out. That's the website. It's looking better than it has. It is nowhere near finished. All the stuff in this talk will eventually be up on there as articles and probably tonight's video as well. If you want to contact me on Twitter, I'm over there at ReedyD. And just so I don't get legal problems, Dungeons and Dragons is a registered trademark of Wizards of the Coast, and I have no affiliation with them nor them.
All right, thanks heaps for that talk, David. That was great. Going to be moving on to the next one now. But before we do, if you have any questions for David, he's also in the Slack group as a reminder. And this next talk is our last talk of the night. It's a quick 10-minute talk from Tom, building an app like Lego with SwiftUI. So let's get started.
G'day everyone, it's Tom here. I think most of you know me, but for those who don't, my details are down below. I run a consultancy, Bare Feetwear. We build apps like the rest of you, I guess. And over the last couple of years, we built a couple of apps that use SwiftUI and combined all the latest Apple goodness. And in the past, I've done talks on building an app like Lego. which some of you have seen before, but today I'm going to specifically talk about building an app like Lego with Swift UI. And I'm just going to use a case study of something that we built recently. We've been building some apps for an energy company and for Clipsal Solar. And although this particular thing I'm going to show isn't in that app, it's something sort of similar where you can monitor the energy that's coming into your home from solar, from battery, from the grid, and where that power is going in the house. And for those of you who've done Swift UI, you'll be probably familiar with using VStacks and HStacks. So I'm just going to run through that today as kind of a lead into the sort of more advanced problem.
Sorry about that. I'll go back to that point. I just wasn't sure why the bar was down the bottom.
Power's going in the house. And for those of you who've done Swift UI, you'll be probably familiar with using VStacks and HStacks. So I'm just going to run through that today as kind of a lead into the sort of more advanced problem. When we build something like this, we've got several things that have dynamic height. So for instance, you can see the solar cell there has no subtitle text, but the battery cell does, and so does the grid cell. So those three cells are potentially different sizes for that reason. And down the bottom, you can see that the text wraps for the ceiling lighting cell, but not for power points and hot water. And that can change according to the size of the screen and font and many other factors. If we imagine this as Lego, so here it is built out of Lego. Hopefully many of you have played with Lego in the past. It was probably my precursor to using computers, and I tend to assemble apps using a similar philosophy. So let's break this down. Let's start off with something very basic just in Swift UI. So we'd probably start off something like this conceptually with a form. In the form here, I've just got text placeholders for each of the components. And then we might get a little more advanced and break that form up into sections. So here you can see we've got our sources, our inverter section, our appliances section, and all I've done in the code is just added a section with a header. And form, which is built into Swift UI, takes care of formatting the section headers different to the text that's in the individual rows, as you can see. But as soon as we want to customize that, it's very limited. So typically, rather than use form for anything that's fairly customized, we instead want to use a VStack. But as soon as we use a VStack, we lose all of that sort of built-in formatting. So you can see here, all I've done is replaced form with a VStack. The same sections and so on are still there, but the formatting is completely gone. So now we need to format it ourselves. And if we think about how we want to format that header, if we think back to our Lego assembly before, then the sections were these blocks that sat on the Lego base plate. And the way I want to format them is to have, as you can see there in the code, I want the foreground color of each one to be secondary. So it's kind of a gray, not a white. I'm using dark mode Lego. And the font is kind of smaller with a sub headline. And it has padding, and distributed is just a convenience function that we use that just adds a sort of expanding spacer on the right-hand side. And if we use the header in our code now, so replacing what was previously just header text with header, the header function using the title, you can see it applies that. So I've used one component. If I go back, I've used this header component and I've used multiple instances in my code here. So that's a nice Lego way of doing things, or a nice component way of doing things. It's good engineering. And then you can see that the solar, battery and grid, in our original, we wanted to have that in some sort of card. And again, form kind of did that for us with a section, but now we're not using forms, so we have to build our own. So we build a card modifier like this. So what we're trying to aim for is the Lego on the right, where we have these cards into which we can put different data. Now we could build that as a view, but we build that as a view modifier. There's the code there. It's going to add padding, a background color. It's going to shape it to be a rounded rectangle with a particular radius and so on. And then all we have to do to use the view modifier is just use .card in our code. So here we've added .card to each of those sections, and each of the content of those sections are wrapped in a VStack. I've also added some padding just to move it away from the edge, and again used our distributed leading. Now, of course, we don't have just plain text in our design here. We want to have all of that data that we saw before for solar and grid and so on. And if we break that down again in terms of like Lego blocks, then it looks something like this on the right. We've got a Lego block for the image, a Lego block for the text, a Lego block for the detailed text, and you can see the code on the left that implements that. And we tend to build any sort of cells or general reusable components where it makes sense to have that same general API, to have an image, text, detailed text. Notice we're not using, the image doesn't say source image or solar image or something that's sort of model specific, because bar cell is just a view and it shouldn't have any knowledge really of the model underlying. So this is a nice reusable component. And if we use that component back in our sort of master Lego, you can see here that our sort of overall Lego plate is made up of 3 bar cells, a couple of dividers, which are just built into SwiftUI, subtitle text. So by using those different components, it simplifies the code quite a bit. And we actually have a function in here called bar cell. So our code would look like this. And here we're actually going over through our model, through our source circuits, as you can see there, for each view model source circuit. So that takes care of the top 3, and similarly down the bottom for appliances. But the important thing there is we've got a bar cell function that knows what to do with the circuit and whether it has a top divider. So this is all basically a teaser for what I want to show you probably next month. This is only meant to be a quick talk. But what if, now that we've got all of this assembled, where we've used SwiftUI's ability to create that sort of free-flowing top to bottom, if we want to align something else to those SwiftUI automatically laid out section headers and cards and so on, what I'm talking about is something like this. So in one of the apps I'm building at the moment, we've got this flow occurring that you can see there on the left. And the problem that I want to solve, which I'm not going to solve today, we have solved it, but I'll leave it for next month, is to find a way to tell SwiftUI where each of those components are on the right, so that it can put together the right positioning for the flow tubes on the left. Like I said, this is just a teaser, so stay tuned next month and chat to me afterwards in Zoom if you like, or Slack. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Cool. Thanks for that, Tom. Thanks for that, David. Hope everyone enjoyed the first CocoaHeads back of the year. I know I'm very much looking forward to next month and having part 2 of Tom's talk. That should be great. So we're going to jump over to a Zoom call now. I'm going to post the link to that in the Slack group in the Meetup channel. So if you'd like to join, feel free to jump on. We'll just have a bit of a chat after the Meetup. But if you're not joining, have a good month and we'll catch you next time. Thanks, everyone.